Welcome to the Pulpit View podcast. My name is Stephen Garrett. With over 20 years of experience in leadership, family, and ministry, I've invited some brothers to join me for a conversation about what it takes to bring balance to each. Why don't you join me on this journey? Let's go. Today, I'm joined by none other than that of Pastor Christopher Todd of New Home Missionary Baptist Church. I want to give him an opportunity to introduce himself. Would you give us a little bit of history about you, where you're from, your wife, your children?
Okay. I'm not a native here in Alabama, but I've been here a long time. I've served as a pastor here for almost 12 years now, and moved here from Texas, but my family's from Missouri. And I've got a beautiful wife, Shay. We've been married for a long time. We've been married for almost 18 years now. And we have three beautiful kids, three girls. I'm a girl dad. 10 just turned 6 and 4.
Come on. That's a whole nother level of stress. I have one girl.
Yeah, that's real tough.
So that kind of helps me answers the next question about how long y'all have been doing ministry together. So ministry has been really a part of the marriage for the majority of the year.
All of it. So I was already preaching when my wife and I met. We actually met at a church gathering, ironically. And so I was already preaching. Ministry has always been a part of our lives and relationship. Even when we were courting, I guess you would say. So I was serving in churches on staff, those kinds of things. So ministry has always been a part of our lives. And she's a church girl too. So, so it's always been there. It's always been in the room.
So I guess one question I would ask is, since you and your wife met during ministry, do you think it's probably just a little bit easier or more difficult to intertwine ministry in that way? Since that's all you all have known, do you think a little bit in the courting stage, it was possibly some difficulties because of your responsibility?
Oh, for sure. There was a time we were engaged, and I was in a church situation that was requiring a lot of time, energy, and effort. And it was pulling me from other responsibilities. We were in school at the time too. We were in this relationship. And we kind of had one of these ultimatum kind of conversations about it. So on one hand, Shay is very understanding and gracious and recognizes the energy and effort that's required in ministry. But then on the same time, I'm always reminded, we always have conversations, even from that time on, very early in our relationship, that doesn't mean you can push all this other stuff to the side. You have a spouse. We will, Lord willing, we did have kids. And so those things have priority, and still, that tug and pull, that juggling act you called it, we still have to have consistent conversations and stuff about that.
I think that's one of the common things within ministry, especially in the Black church, because one of the things that I have started to notice is many times there's a heavy weight on preachers in general to be married, but even more so in balancing that family, it's almost as if you're balancing two different marriages.
Yes.
So
my wife calls the church sometimes the other wife. Yeah.
And sometimes the other wife doesn't give as much privileges or perks as the first wife.
Certainly.
So it's hard to explain the balance.
Certainly. And it's something that for me, it just doesn't it's never been okay, it's kind of settled. And because in life in general, and certainly in ministry, there's not necessarily routine.
Yeah.
You know, Sunday comes every 7 days. But outside of that, there are so many things that are at play and change from day to day, from week to week, especially when you start adding more dynamics, people, your own personal family life. And so it's something that we're constantly wrestling with and kind of, you know, have to stay in constant communication about.
Yeah, I think communication is key. I think communication might be one of the things that is the hardest for us to do, but the most necessary thing for us to do. I know for myself personally, I had to get over that place of shutting down to analyze my situation. So I guess one of the questions I would ask of you, just to help some of our audience that might be listening, how are some ways, this is probably more for the wives, how are some ways to get us to communicate a little bit better? Or some ways that she may have learned you to kind of get the information? Is it direct? Is it indirect?
Both. If you know my wife, she's a pretty direct person, which is one of the things I appreciate about her. You know where she's at, and you know where she stands. And I'm in a place, and we've been married long enough, 17 years is a long time, where I recognize that's who she is. And so we are vulnerable enough with each other to come to the table and say, hey, this is kind of where I'm at on the issue, or like this thing with management. I try to we try to think ahead and forward, and she is gracious in that, we recognize, okay, there are some times and seasons where it's going to pull a little bit more this way. And then you need to make sure and balance that to where you pull back a little bit more with the home and family life too. And kind of that back and forth, so that you're not neglecting one for the other, and so we talk a lot. And I think, to be honest with you, that's probably one of the saving graces in our relationship and home life and with the church, in that we've talked a lot. We talk a lot about it. And even when we disagree and we're trying to kind of iron things out, we know we got to talk through this. You can't avoid the difficulties. You have to kind of look at them head on, because avoiding them doesn't make them go away.
Yeah.
It just delays it, or, adds more fuel to the fire. And so you've got to, keep working at it and keep kind of talking through it. And that's worked well for us for the most part over the course of time. And then, you kind of know what's involved after a while too. So, yeah.
I love it. I guess, and you kind of laid way to this, because ministry is not as predictable outside of Sunday or Wednesday or Tuesday, whatever your Bible study night may be. What are some of the major challenges you've seen or dealt with in leadership when it comes to ministry?
That's a good question. I think for me here, it's just the balance of schedule. So my kids are getting a little older, so they're becoming more active. And I'm at a very lay-led congregation, so it's not like we got staff sitting in the office working from 8 to 5. So a lot of the meetings, leadership, vocational things is night and weekends, right? That's the same time your kids got practices and games and activities and things of that nature. So trying to navigate through that scheduling wise. For me, this particular congregation has been very gracious and kind at that time. And I try to respond in kind by being very strategic and intentional about the time that we spend together outside of Sunday.
Yeah.
So our leadership time and meetings and those kinds of things, you have to have them. But I'll try to be intentional about making the most of that time, so I can make sure that I have time for my family.
Oh, I love it. So I know it can sometimes feel overwhelming, almost like we're in, we don't have enough time in the day, or we're in that movie Multiplicity, where you need about 5 or 6 of you to manage all of the responsibility.
That'd be great.
Yeah, it would. But since we don't have that, and be honest with you, I'm sure you probably laid the same testimony I have. If it had not been for the Lord on my side. But what are some of the things that you probably will say that you have done to manage that overwhelming responsibility that you just spoke of, such as the time outside? But what are some of the things you've done in the church? Because some of our members can feel neglected. It's one of us. It might be 150.
Yeah.
Even if it's 10 of them.
Yeah.
I tell my members this when I first came to the church, and it was hard. But I told them, I said, you have the responsibility of learning me.
Mm-hmm.
I have the responsibility of learning all of you. Mm-hmm. I just need a little bit of time.
Yeah.
One of us have just a little bit more to learn than the other. And so what would you say are some things that you've done to kind of condense all of that you have to do in such a short amount of time?
Man, that's a multi-faceted question. You know what? For me, there are a couple of things that come to mind. First of all, I've honestly just come to the recognition and realization that everything that I want to do, I'm not going to get it all done today. That's good. So I kind of start out my week with a long list of to-dos. Because one of my challenges is it's not just ministry here, but it's kind of other avenues of ministry, and I do other stuff too. Mm-hmm. And so it's a juggling act between multiple areas of ministry that can stretch you broad, and you want to be deep everywhere, and you have a wife and a family and a life outside of vocational ministry. Everything is ministry, right, for everybody but vocational ministry. So I just come to the realization I'm not going to get accomplished everything every day.
Yeah.
So I need to choose and think about and pray about what is the most urgent and important, and kind of gauge my time every day as I go and kind of go from there. And that changes because emergencies come up and phone calls come. A 10-minute, which you thought was 10 minutes, is 30 minutes or an hour, or one of my kids is having a rough day. I need to spend some extra one-on-one time with them today. All of those things come up. And so I have to realize that for myself. Mm-hmm. Everything that needs to get done will eventually get done. And yes, I need to meet all of my deadlines, but everything will not get done today. I love it. And that's okay. And then another piece for me is, just as a pastor, I've been doing kind of some expositional study of Ephesians 4, is to realize that I'm not supposed to do all the ministry.
Come on. That's good.
Yeah. And that's so, but that requires a couple of things. Like, I have to genuinely equip and empower other people to do things. And then I have to let them do it. And then I have to be patient and gracious with them to allow them to do it in their own space and time and way. I have to trust God with all of that. That's really hard.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a visionary, or your personality type is very, you're very driven and passionate. You have a lot of passion, which a lot of us as pastors and leaders do. You have to rein in on that drive sometimes to be patient, to allow other people to kind of blossom and bloom and to really take on that kind of, the work of the ministry. But I think that's how God designed it. And that's what Ephesians 4 kind of talks about, God gives pastors to equip the people for the work of ministry. If I'm doing all the work, that means that we can't be what God wants us to be, those following verses there at the end of chapter 4. So I think that's another piece for me. That's something I have to work on with myself too, because it's like, well, a lot of things I can do this myself. I can do these things better. And then your church has expectations of you too. And just to teach that, some of these expectations are biblical. Some of these expectations, are true, but, I'm one, like you said, I'm one person. There's 150 of you guys. I have 280 people in church roll. Somebody else will have to do some things too.
Yeah. One of our principles at the podcast Pulpit View is equip, empower, excel. Because I believe the only way as a community we actually get the goal accomplished is by giving them what they need, empowering them to use it, but then allowing them to excel. But like you said, one of my personal struggles is that I'm an entrepreneur by trait. And it's hard to get rid of the trait for the calling. And for me, it's if you don't do it, don't one person stop no show. We just gonna find someone and keep moving it, or I'll do it myself. But that is the difficulty, I think, in leadership that you just expounded on perfectly. I am not meant to do all of the ministry myself. And that is a hard task. I think a lot of us deal with burnout. Yeah. Because we're trying to visit every sick. We're trying to make every appointment. I'm just going to tell one of my personal, I had to start to lean on my deacons more. And I saw the empowering that I gave them by leaning on them. And in the church, the deacon and pastor ministry for years has been kind of
it can be very contentious.
Contentious. And so I learned that I really had some good men that wanted to help the goal of the church. And overall, most do. They just don't understand what it properly is until you teach it. Yeah. And sometimes it seems almost redundant. It's like teaching my children sometimes, not equating them to children, but it's like teaching my children sometimes. You know they should be able to get it, but you don't want to walk them through the process. And so I had to deal with that. So that's something that is not only noteworthy, but necessary.
Yeah. I mean, and here's the thing, on the flip side, I'm not advocating laziness or lethargy, right? So I don't want to be misunderstood. But I mean, we work hard. There are so many things. I mean, there are so many areas in the life of a community of faith that need to be addressed and handled with. And it's about relationships with people. And I'm engaged in those relationships, but I, as one person, cannot be engaged in all of those relationships all at the same time by myself. It's not practical, and it's not biblical, I believe and suggest, and I think I have some pretty firm ground in that regard. And so, my primary responsibility is to equip the people of God to do the work of ministry. I'm walking alongside of you in this and doing this work. I have my part to play, but we all have a part to play, and kind of making that clear, reiterating that, not just in sermonically, but in action and activity and what you do, I think is really important. And I've found that's a different hard work. Yeah. But I found it freeing at the same time, in that, okay, I can focus on these things that, God has really assigned for me to do as a part of this church as their pastor. And it might not work how I think it should. I grind my teeth every now and then. I'm on my knees a lot. But God's will be done. And in a lot of cases, it'll end up eventually being better than what I imagined. And that takes a lot of patience, persistence, and just grace.
So, because I heard you say something, not only is it more than likely biblical, and I would argue it is biblical, but when you look at it from a relationship status, that really mirrors the relationship we have with Christ. He gives us a calling. He gives us direction towards something. And he gives you the product of it. Yeah. But Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but it wasn't until God gave the increase. He'll do the increase part, but it takes a process
Yeah.
to get to that fruition of what you desire. And I think that walks alongside what we're talking about. He walks alongside of us, but that doesn't mean he's going to pick up the seeds and put them in the ground
Yeah.
just because he walks alongside
Yeah.
of us. I guess the next question I would have in that is during the pandemic, we have seen pastors that have literally walked away from their church.
Yeah.
They've stepped away. I'm reading a book currently now called Dangerous Calling by Paul David Tripp. And he said something in the book that resonated with me so hard. And it was how many of us are silently dealing with these things because we're putting all this compound responsibility on us. I guess the question that I have, because one of the reasons that it's believed many have walked away is this guilt. So with what you have just mentioned, how do we keep ourselves from feeling guilty about not being everyone, not having multiple us going around? Is there a way that we can kind of bring ourselves back in tune to the biblical standard that God has set and not feel that guilt of, I didn't meet this person or I didn't get to see this person before they passed? Many of us as pastors, we lost members that we weren't able to see, but we cared about during the pandemic. Is there, and you might not be able to get rid of that guilt, but if there's some things that you've done that in the process of spreading out some of that responsibility so you can focus on the main thing, how would some steps you may have taken?
You get loaded questions, man. I probably wrestled with some of that in these last couple of years, and you worked harder and more diligently. I look back over the last couple of years at some of the stuff that we did and went through as a church. I'm thinking, I don't even know how I survived that. On top of the emotional weight, just trying to bear more, just the sort of, we were literally trying to survive. With our health, physically, personally, in the middle of the pandemic, and trying to lead groups of people through uncharted times and unknown, not this the unknown. And I think a lot of us still haven't. I tell some friends of mine that are also pastors, I don't think we fully understood the weight we were carrying over these last couple of years. We haven't felt that full brain. I think a lot of people are fatigued. I think just being honest with yourself about your fatigue. And for me, being honest and having those honest conversations with God about your fatigue and where you are in those regards, I think is a real place. Before I make rash decisions, though, I need to be vulnerable with the Lord.
Come on.
And so God can handle that level of vulnerability too. We're talking about that here in a series on grief here at the church, is that God can handle our frustrations and anger with all of those things, those feelings of guilt. He can handle all of that, but then in knowing that he can handle it, he will also handle us, and if you've done everything that you could with what you had, there's really nothing for us to feel guilty about. At the end of the day. We can be hurt. Certainly a number of us are fatigued. And I think too, we need to talk that out with God. And I also think a lot of us need to talk that out with somebody else, whether it's a professional, just a good friend or a colleague. I think one of the challenges with the pandemic is with social distancing and the way we were kind of trying to do life, is that we've missed out on the relationships of proximity.
Love it.
And, everybody needs a friend. And so, just talking that out with somebody else, I think is really helpful. And then too, as we're kind of, I guess, coming out or coming into a new normal, I know for me, it's one of these places, I need to find some rest, like for real rest, I'm reminded of Elijah on Mount Carmel, great spiritual battle. The prophets of Baal are gone. God showed him so strong. And then they put a warrant out on for Elijah's life, and he's on the run, and he's depressed and, overwhelmed, and just from the sheer exhaustion of what he's dealing with, he needs to take a nap.
Yeah.
And I think we forget this. It's like, just take a minute, and I think a lot of pastors need that too. Before you quit, have you really given it all to God? Have you talked it out with somebody privately and personally? And really, have you taken the space and time to really get some genuine rest?
That kind of brings me to my next point, because what you just said is vital. I think one of the reasons that in our churches, we have such a high level of divorce, we have a high level of pastors leaving, we have a high level of health issues in our church, is because we lack taking personal time. And we almost, as my wife would like to say, we've created a martyrdom effect. We kind of worship it. And me and her a lot of times talk about how it so correlates to motherhood, that you almost feel guilty that you want to take a break.
Yeah.
And there is a necessity for that time. I was telling somebody the other day here, God took rest. The creator of all, who neither slumbers nor sleep, took rest, but we feel guilty about it. So I would ask this, because we've talked before about the necessity of sabbaticals, taking time. Just some thoughts off your top of your head. What are some ways a pastor might be able to slowly add some breaks into his ministry life? We know he might not be able to automatically come into the church and say, I'm taking a month off. I'll see y'all and I need paid leave with it. What are some steps you may be able to take?
So I think, of course, every church dynamic is different. I think everything starts with just teaching and preaching it. So here's the irony for me here. So 2020, it was my year 10 here. And I had kind of talked about, and, I had taught about it a little bit, and I try to encourage other leaders, lay leaders here who were very active and whatever, you need to take a break too. I advocate that for all of those who serve here. You need to take some time. You need to use all your time off, those kinds of things. Even in seasons when I wasn't, I'd advocated that for them. So I kind of got into a place where I was like, okay, I kind of need an extended break. And I just asked, to be honest with you, I asked. And my leaders were okay, we understand. It's been 10 years, you've been here a while, so that's fine. Then the pandemic hit. Didn't take it. I worked more in 2020 and 2021 than I ever had, to be honest. And then for me in 2021, I had a series of very close family deaths that kind of pulled me away, but not really rest. It was grief and being with family related. So that wasn't the kind of break that I needed. And so I'm kind of cycling back to where now it's like, okay, you need to go back and recapture that extra time that you spent away. You need that, and your church needs that. And the way I've kind of said it to my congregation is, for me to be the best me that I can be, to not be overly bitter and cynical and callous, for me to hear from God with clarity, I need a minute. I just need a minute. And for the most part, that's why I say New Home is a great congregation. I understand that, because I don't want to get to that place where it's like, I just don't have anything left to give.
Yeah.
And so I think it starts with teaching and preaching and laying that foundation. And then trying to, whatever you have available, to make the best use of it. And I think that's, for me, that's where a counterbalance for my wife comes into play, because I can be a workaholic.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, there are some seasons she's like, I've gotten some times in places where I worked so much and was so stressed it made me like physically ill. And it's like, and so she knows kind of those warning signs. And so, she lovingly, but very passionately is like, you know what, before you get there, you need to stop.
Yeah.
Take this afternoon and I'm going to take your phone for a few hours.
Yeah.
And I've given her the latitude to do that. And I'm all the more blessed because of it. And that's what I'm saying, letting other people in your space and in your life to do that. It's not just her, because, it's a group of colleagues, a group of friends of ours. We do that with each other. It's like, bro, you're a little more edgy than normal. Or it's kind of four of us in a group. We've all dealt with various seasons of grief in the pandemic, personal grief. Man, you need to take some time off. Like, don't rush back to the pulpit, because you won't be God's best vessel if you do that. In the long run, it's going to hurt you more.
Yeah.
And the idea of martyrdom is just it's not biblical. Jesus himself, he has compassion and ministers to the crowd, and he goes off to a desolate place to pray.
Yeah.
And, when they're crossing the sea, Jesus is asleep. He ministers to those urgent needs, but he takes that time away, and that's vital and necessary.
Yeah.
If God the Father does that at creation, if the Son does that in the ministry, he ends up dying for our sins. What makes us think we're better than the Lord? That's and here's the other thing. If it's not necessarily paid, if you can, do your best to try and do it anyway. Because your life depends on it,
Yeah.
Your life depends on it. I think that's making it a higher priority and explaining that. Here's another thing, we'll be honest. I'm rambling here. I think sometimes we don't take that time because we feel like we're needed. We have a super pastor syndrome. But I've been in ministry long enough. I've been preaching for 25 years, I think, something like that, a long time. Almost 25 years. We've seen enough pastors and preachers who have literally worked themselves to the bone in a church in a pulpit, and they died doing it, probably prematurely.
Yeah.
We mourn their loss. We funeralize them. We drape that chair, and then the church moves on.
Yeah.
And there's a spouse and kids and others who will always feel that grief and loss, especially if it's premature. And a church has moved on. And so I am not the savior of this church.
Come on.
My pastor reminds me of that regularly too. He says, at the end of the day, the church is not mine. It's the Lord's. And then we go in that mind and say, I am a servant of God. Even Paul describes himself as a slave of the gospel. But even in being a slave, there has to be some measures of self-care so that you can be all that God would have you be in that assignment. You cannot be effective for 7 hours, bitter and tired.
But kind of begs the point, God being the perfect master, that extra a lot of times is us, not him, because he knows what we need. I guess something that you pointed out, I think that really was highlighted for me, because it resembles me and my wife's relationship a lot, is how she is the opposite enough to help you get the rest you need. What is on the scale of importance, what is the level of importance of her being able to help you detach in ministry from the day to day, so you can still adequately be what is needed at home and in other places. Because the truth of the matter is, most of our churches only see us in one aspect. They may get glimpse into our families, but we know for a fact there's a lot that you can hide on Sunday that they don't see Monday through Saturday. So what's the level of importance of giving her that leeway? Because it is something that you have to give. There's a point that we can be married but still separated from the emotional communicative part. So what is that scale for you?
I think for me, because it's been a lifeline for us, it's really important. And that comes with a lot of grace in communication too. And just continual, like I said earlier, wrestling with that tension. So, there are seasons when it's just really, really busy, right? And my wife Shay has to be, and she is very gracious in understanding that. Like, you're called to serve. We know that. And so there are times when you do have to do that. But then at the same time, you cannot, and I will not allow you to totally neglect both me and our family. I think she's been very gracious with me. And so because I recognize that she's been very gracious to me, I'm going to take a lot of personal effort to acknowledge that and respond to that. And, I'm at the age now, my kids talk back. And so you can tell, like, okay, Dad, you spend enough time in church. Why are you going to that meeting again? It's like, those are my cues. If you listen, you can get them, And so it's like, okay, I need to pause, and I need to spend some more very intentional time. And I think that's the thing. For me, it's about being intentional.
Yeah.
And for me, because it's easier for me because I've been doing it so long, for my church and church life to come first. I need to be very intentional with my wife, my kids.
It almost seems like with them girls, they'll make sure you know your intention.
Oh yeah, they'll let me know.
I'll tell anybody. Girls, I think they get way more leeway with dads than boys do. My boys would watch their mouth. My daughter would be like, Daddy, I hadn't had no time in a while.
Yeah.
When did it come?
And hearing the examples, we got to listen to our elders. We all know a pastor or a preacher who will tell you, I didn't have to do this. I didn't have to go there. I didn't have to be so involved here. And not that you're you're abandoning responsibilities, but I chose all of these other things because I was, chasing the revival circuit, or I was always on the road, and I lost my family. And I think for a lot of us as preachers and teachers, especially been doing it for a long time, I started preaching as a teenager. It's almost easier to do that, to be on the road, to preach, than it is to handle those personal relationships with your wife and your kids.
Yeah.
Shay and I just made a commitment very early on that, we know it's going to be difficult. We know there are going to be times where we may not always agree about it, but we're going to do our best to kind of be intentional about, especially with our kids when we started having kids. We're going to be intentional about, making sure that we don't neglect them in those kinds of personal needs. Now, on the flip side, I'm trying to teach my kids, this is what Daddy does, and we're all invested in ministry. Because I believe every believer is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And you guys, my oldest daughter is saved. And, you as a believer should be invested in the life of ministry too. Not just because you're my daughter, but because you're a child of God.
Yeah.
But, I need to make sure that I'm marked, present, and available. And there's sometimes my wife has some, she's hurt my feelings sometimes. You're just not here. I need you to be here. And after I get over myself and my feelings, yeah, you're right. I just have to be honest about that. You know,
Yeah.
you have to let other people speak into your lives to see those blind spots that you don't see.
Love it.
In yourself.
Love it. And I'm winding down questioning because I'll hold you all day. This is just a great conversation.
Yeah, this has been good.
One of the things that I learned talking about wives hurting your feelings, I remember when I started pastoring Bethlehem, it was a moment where I am kind of dropped off into a ministry about double the size, triple the size that I had before. And, meetings every night. I remember my wife telling me something, and she said one night, she said, I had to learn how to not need you. I think she said, you're not God. And even though everything she said was right, correct, it crushed my spirit.
Yeah.
One of the reasons it crushed my spirit was because I believed that was the area that I had under control. And the church was the area I needed to get a grip on. And so I guess the next question that I would have for you is when it comes to, because I recognized there was an area that I had thought was successful that was unsuccessful. What are some metrics that you have placed in your life to determine what successful ministry may be? And when I say ministry, I'm not even just talking about as a pastor, but your spiritual life. That successful spiritual goal that you accomplished, successful family life, and then successful pastoral or leadership life.
I'll start with the footnote. I am definitely not a master at this.
Come on.
This is a work in progress. Because we all, especially with ministry, both personal and pastoral, in the life of a church, we've all kind of been intrinsically taught that certain metrics are measures of success.
Yeah.
How many people, and the budget, and the building, and how much you're called, and to preach here and there, your travel schedule, your itinerant schedule, your denominational activity, all of those things we've been somewhere in there, we've placed as measures of success. And I bit off of those apples a lot. And for me here, that was an apple that was rotten. I serve in a very, very small community. Where it's not just floods of people moving to Coosa County every day, or, a whole bunch of new people that are necessarily coming to your church. And we've seen those things, and then at the end of the day, when we had a bigger building and more people and a bigger budget, you still didn't feel successful.
Yeah.
And so I had to reevaluate what that looked like. And so for me, I still struggle with that in some seasons and times. But for me, at the end of the day, what I honestly recognize is successful is what I talked about with Ephesians 4. People engaged in the work of the ministry, so that we grow into mature manhood and the unity of the faith. And so for me, that's less about some of those physical metrics and more about what kind of impact and influence do we have in the individuals' lives, in our community, and across the globe.
Love it.
And so I want to look at impact. Impact is not always financial. Impact is oftentimes happens in relationship, one-on-one relationships. The challenge, a lot of people don't stay at churches long enough to see their impact. You and I we talked about this before. It'll be 12 years this summer that I've been here. I'm seeing the buds of seeds that were 12 years planted. This building that we're sitting in today is not my seed. That was the seed from a predecessor 20 years prior.
Yeah.
And so I think impact? How are we influencing our community? How are we making a real impact in our community? And, broad across the globe, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the whole spots of the world. For my family, I pray this for my kids every night, is that I want them to grow in wisdom and stature, the favor of God and man. I want them to know Jesus.
Come on.
And I want them to love him and to love serving him through his church. It may sound negative, but this is a real place. I don't want my kids as pastors' kids to hate the church.
Come on. That's me.
Yeah. I want them to love God and serve him and serve in his church, and they probably see, they see, and I try to keep my kids from obviously the all the craziness they can have, but there are not so good things that happen in the life of church and with people, whatever. I mean, we're people, right? But in that, I try to teach, their valuable lessons in grace and the overwhelming nature of God's love for us and those kinds of things. And so I want them to love God and love his church. And that's what I pray for myself too, is not to be so bitter or callous about church. Yeah. And I think if I try to do that, and at the end of the day, hopefully when my kids are older, they say, my dad, he loved God's church, but he loved us too.
I love it.
And he didn't, I might not have made everything, but I was present, and I admonished them and trained them up, and I invested in their lives and their well-being spiritually, first and foremost, because it makes no sense for me, for my kids to be like successful in the world and not know God.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. So spiritually first, but also just in life in general, I'm hoping I've done okay. And the same thing with my wife, I want my wife to be the best Shay that God created her to be. Yeah. And that means, we serve in ministry together in a lot of capacities. And so that means in her exercising her gifts, skills, and talents through God's church. That means, encouraging her as my kid's mother and, trying to support her and provide and protect her as her husband. Me doing that as her husband. I'm definitely not perfect at it at all. Actually, I think sometimes I'm pretty terrible. Yeah, if you be honest. But, if I'm giving God my all and I'm keeping these things in front of me, I may not have gotten it all right today, but hopefully I'm continuing to move forward in that regard. And that's the thing with the church. I think time in a church and in marriage has kind of taught me, I think I overestimate what I can do in a short period of time. But I think we can underestimate how far God can bring us, with consistency and perseverance. We want stuff so fast. Yeah. So quick and most things in life, honestly, the good things in life don't happen overnight.
It takes time.
Yeah. You gotta stew it and slow cook it. And even in church life, we're in established churches, and when we showed up, there are a lot of things that's like, wait a minute, this is so outdated and antiquated and whatnot. But we push and pursue and teach and preach and lead and guide, but it still takes some time.
Yeah. And even the outdated and antiquated took a time for that previous pastor to get them to that point.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the hardest things.
And it took time for it to get antiquated.
Yeah. It was the best that they had in that season. We talk sometimes in church about certain days. And I remember I talked to a pastor friend, and he said, man, you gonna combine these days? I said, no. He said, man, but I don't understand why not. They give you a headache. I said, here's the reason why. Because they love them and they work for them. Mm-hmm. I said, I don't have to get them to give their best for these days. I said, it causes extra time on my hand. But if from that they are getting growth, spiritual maturity, working well together, then why get rid of something that helps me in other aspects?
Yeah.
And so I completely agree with you. It took a while for it to get antiquated. It takes some time for us to see the success that we want. I guess the next question would be, as we're winding down, is we had this pandemic, and I don't ever want to gloss over that.
Mm-hmm.
What are some strategies? Not really in the church, because I think that was on the job training. But for me, and I think for many pastors that are in marriage with children, we had to learn strategies to balance that with having so much of a load. Well, there's some new strategies that you learned during the pandemic that helped you on outside of the church.
In what regard?
Strategies of planning with family. I'll tell you something we developed. We developed a Sabbath day for Monday because we recognized how much work had to go in on Sunday, that by the time we got home, we didn't want to be bothered with nobody. And because we had a day, every day is almost allocated. Monday, which is usually most folk work day, became our Sabbath day.
Yeah.
Are there some type of strategies that you were able to develop or apply to your life that helped you to kind of bring some structure, some balance to these areas that probably were not as highly looked at before the pandemic?
No, that's a tough one. I don't know, because during the pandemic, my work-life balance was terrible. I think I'll say this. So I think for me, I don't know if it's a balance in time as it is trying to be more intentional, to just be present and to listen, especially at home. So I've always tried to do that, but I think I had to be more intentional, because like while we're going through a pandemic at church, my kids are going through this too, and it's affecting them. You know, my kids are in public schools. They went virtual, so I'm trying to handle the unknowns in leading a congregation, but also the unknowns in our own lives.
Yeah.
And so trying to be just a present and listening ear to my kids. And to be honest with you, the pandemic had all of us talking to the Lord a lot more than probably what we were. And just, I think another thing is to finding other like-minded people just to kind of think through life.
Yeah, that's good.
My wife and I are really big on accountability. And it's not, we have a large accountability circle. We don't. It's, a handful of people that we've trusted to kind of speak into our lives, to where I can easily get off course and work-life balance. So to speak into our lives, to help me keep that in the forefront of my mind. And so I think just being critically aware of that and allowing people to speak into our lives in the middle of kind of what we are dealing with. And then I've said it a lot, but I think just even having more grace with people.
Yeah.
So, there are a lot of emotions and just a lot of hesitation, and I would say fear, right? And so just trying to be more gracious with people is something, on a practical note, I found for me that I try to kind of decompress Monday, and so not totally like take off. So I do a couple of small things Monday just to kind of set my week off, and set myself up for what I've got for the rest of the week. And so there's usually another day of the week. It's usually Tuesdays or Thursdays that I try to kind of cut off a little bit, or do something I want to do for myself.
Yeah.
So, trying to do that. I haven't always done well at that, to be quite honest. Yeah. But making a concerted attempts to do that. Not to be legalistic about it, but to do that. So those are the things, and I don't know.
I think what you're saying though is what most of us want to apply. For me, it wasn't until later that I was able to start building that core group and understanding that group did not need to be a large group. In fact, probably it works better if it's a small group of folk. That was necessary, and I think that is needed, and that we don't get so rigid with everything, but just having some things. Because you can, for me, I'm a very, ironically, because life probably wouldn't show this, but I'm a very schedule-oriented person. If I break that schedule, it throws off my whole day. And I had to give leeway for schedules to be broken.
And that's really hard. Because in listening and in hearing, with my wife and my kids, there's almost always going to be a time and space where the schedule needs to be broken. And I'll confess, there have been a lot of times when they're really, really frustrated. And I was a not pleasant person, because of that. And so I'm still working on this. I'm like, you know what? That's okay. You're going to be okay. At some point, you got to do the work, right? But in this moment, it's okay. And just to be okay with that. It's not anything, because, one of the things for me, a blessing for me is there are a lot of things that are rigid in schedule, but then there are a lot of times and spaces where I have choices on what to do with my time. And so I've got to make sure that I don't give everybody else kind of leftovers, but I try to be intentional with them. And it gives me latitude to say when those times where I have to pull away more, well, that I can do that because I've been very intentional about my time. The pandemic for me and our kids, we were just together a lot. Because we were all, hunkered in and shut down, and we just spent time. And it was hard, but then at the same time, it was a blessing. It reminded me of this is really important, this time together. And it's actually been kind of difficult the more we kind of get back into normal schedules. It's like, oh, wait, you're not going to be here like 22 hours of the day. I'm like, no, I can't do that anymore because we have to have meetings in person now and those kinds of things. And so, but like to try and treasure that time. My wife is very dogmatic about and that's the thing for people on a schedule. Now we did try to do this. We do try to do this. Like I schedule downtime, like put it in the books. And I try not to be overly dogmatic about it, but I try, a lot of stuff that comes up isn't as urgent. And I don't want to neglect people, but it's not that urgent. Like I'll get back to you.
I remember a book by the name of Ordering Your Private World, Gordon McDonald. He says in there, he would have a member say, me and my husband are getting ready to divorce. I need you to talk to me right now. He said, me and my wife would have something planned. He said, and because it was on the day that I set aside for us, I'd always tell them to schedule it another day. That someone asked, why, how could you do it? He said, because no one felt the need to call me before the divorce papers were going to be certified. So I think they can wait another day. And he said, and usually, he said 90 times out of 100, they're able to wait till the next day if I give them the access to me on another day, because a lot of times we as people, we see what we're going through at the moment as important. And I think we as pastors, we usually put our life on the back end sometimes and put everyone else's.
Emergencies do come up.
Yeah,
you know,
they do.
Life and death situations do happen. But I think when those things happen, when those genuine things happen, because I've been so intentional and kind of day after day, week after week, month after month, trying to be intentional. Some days better than others, of having quality time, with others. It gives me more latitude for when those genuine emergencies do come up. And I will be quite frank in saying that I have a church that is very, very kind to me with that. They want to see my family prosper because they want to make sure I'm with my kids. They know I'm engaged in some other activities. So much so that sometimes I have to be like, wait a minute, I need to know what's going on, And so we consistently kind of try to embed that in the culture here.
Yeah.
When we work, we want to work hard and we give all that we have. But God also holds us responsible and accountable to these other areas of our lives. That's ministry too.
Yeah.
And it all goes hand in hand. It makes no sense if I'm a dynamic preacher and, we go through our share of struggles and strains and, we have transitions in life and whatnot. But if I'm just terrible at it at home, but I'm a dynamic preacher, I failed.
Yeah.
And that's something I really keep in front of me. I just don't want to fail in that regard. I don't want to fail God.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Last question, and I'm going to let you on out of here. We have a lot of young pastors that are getting married. They're beginning ministry. And where my heart is I want us to develop a resource for them to understand they're not by themselves. This is not, as a pastor, many times we feel like we're the only one that's ever went through. We're the only one who dealt with a church getting ready to vote us out. We're the only one dealt with a deacon ministry that doesn't seem to want to work alongside of us. We're the only one who dealt with financial issues. We're the only one who didn't seem to have enough time for the family. And so I want to help create a space for them that they understand they're not in it by themselves.
Yeah.
So as a more senior pastor now, you and me both are still kind of young.
Yeah.
But we can say I've been married 16 years, you were married 17. And you can't say you got some iron in the fire now. What is some advice looking back over your ministry that if you could give to a young pastor, even if it could be yourself, you go back in time and say, Todd, do this. This is going to help you lose a lot of stress in your life.
Yeah.
What's one of those? What's a major thing?
I don't know if I can narrow it to one.
Give it to us how you will.
Okay. Serving as a pastor in the church takes a lot of time, energy, and effort, but it should not take all of your time, energy, and effort.
I love that.
Yeah. I eat, breathe, sleep this church, because I want to see her prosper and I want to see God's people be biblically successful, right? But I also want to see my wife and my family and my kids be successful. And for my wife particularly, because she's been with me this whole ride, and also my kids, they have sacrificed a lot for me to serve this church in the capacity and the way that I do. I don't want to minimize that or be overly neglectful of their sacrifice, and they are worthy of reverence and respect and honor because of that. And so while I give a lot of energy here, I cannot give it all here and have nothing left to give. And that's a tension that you will probably always wrestle with. At least for me, in this season of my life, I will, yeah, that's the kind of the one piece. I think everything filters down from there. There's some stuff that we fuss and fight about. It's really not worth all that fuss.
Yeah.
And if you're a family or whatever, if you understand that it's always, you're always trying to, I don't even want to call it balance, because I don't think it's balance. I think it's, I think I heard E. Dewey Smith said this is managing the chaos.
Love it.
If you recognize that it's that, you can find some peace in the middle of that chaos. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm not always, my work-life balance, it may be off kilter sometimes, but don't let it always be off balance on the work end. There are some seasons where it's, I just need to put this aside and just go kind of do life for a minute.
Yeah.
Not, forever, but for a minute. And so while you give a lot of time, energy, and effort to the Lord's church, don't let that be all of your energy.
I love it.
Have something in the tank for at home. And small can be significant in both of those, in your church life and in your family life. Yeah.
I love it. Dr. Thank you so much.
Man, this has been an enlightening conversation for me and eye-opening. So thank you.
It's my privilege. One of the hopes here, like I said, is to really create a dialogue that I don't think we are able to develop that quick. We live in a society now that people have really, even before the pandemic, started to kind of hunker down into their own little shells. And one of the privileges we've had is we've had conversations that having the conversation has blessed me and helped me look at things differently. And I know some of your core group as well, and I have my core group. And one of the blessings from that is that you're able to have these conversations outside of here.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of us are sinking.
Yeah.
And we don't have the resource. And so
don't die on the vine by yourself.
Yeah.
This thing is too heavy for you to try to do it on your own. And this pandemic showed us that none of us, we have guys, all of us have guys that are in major ministries in large cities and thousands of people that we admire and look up to. When the pandemic hit, we were all in the same boat.
Man. Amen.
And so none of us knows it all or has it all. And so that's the gift of, humility with other pastors that we hadn't had all this figured out. What are you doing? How are you doing this? Not just in church life, but in home life too. Not to say you have to divulge all your personal garbage with somebody else, but how did you tell it, like what we talked about today? How did you kind of tell your congregation, I need some more time? Like for me with death, and we're wrapping up. For me with death last year, I needed that for myself. And my church was okay. They were more okay with it than I was, I think. And everybody around me was good. I was like, oh man, this is taking forever. And it's at the end of the day, it's like, no, this is what you needed. And I think we have some people that are much more gracious about that. I hope if we're teaching and preaching the word of God, they're more gracious about that than we give them credit sometimes.
I tell my deacon sometimes, the job of the pastor is not crisis resolution. It's crisis management. I said, because many times I said, we're thinking we can resolve something that was there years before us and will be there years after.
Yeah.
And I think when you do crisis management successfully, that when they notice that you're in a crisis yourself, they're able, as one preacher says, to shepherd the shepherd. they're able to sow back into the shepherd. Every now and then, the shepherd needs some wool to sleep with and some meat to eat. And so we need them to be able to do that. And I think when we give them the leeway to love us, because I think that's hard. Trusting.
Because we've all been burned.
We've all been burned.
But that's not all of the experience, not everyone. And even when we are getting burned, these kind of conversations to know, hey, I'm not alone. This is not just my struggle. You know, that's encouraging by itself. And so to know that for those who are watching, that you're not alone, and we're all trying to figure this thing out. And some days are good and some days are not.
You gotta be okay with that.
Exactly.
It does not make a mark of where your ministry is because you're dealing with a bad day. Most successful pastors in our terminology or world's terminology that we utilize have had some of the hardest days. I've read the stories of how Pastor Ralph West had lost the church that he was pastoring before the Church Without Walls. Just story after story. One pastor I read, he had to sleep in his office. And we see the glory part of the story, but we don't see none of that pain. And so I'm just want to tell you again, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Listen, we hope some of you all have been blessed today by this conversation. Continue to come with us on this journey as we meet not just pastors, but other leaders that have been balancing or maintaining this chaos. I love it. Maintaining this, maintaining and prioritizing their world to see the best that God has for them. Listen, thank you. Join us again. You all have a great day. This is Stephen Garrett. This is
Christopher Todd.
And we are grateful to have you today.